You know what I do like?
Mm.
Quality guacamole.
Yeah, I like reverse proxying into virtual machines as well.
Who doesn't? And it's such an effective platform. I'm
And
glad
open
that it's open
source.
source. Yeah. Look at that. We're on the same wavelength here. There's nothing more delicious than open source guacamole.
That's
Really.
that should be a t-shirt, a deeply, deeply confusing t-shirt.
Hello, alleged human, and welcome to the Chaos Lover podcast. My name is Ned, and I'm definitely not a robot. I'm a real human person who wears t-shirts sometimes and also walks around and loves tortilla chips. I don't know. It got away from me. T-shirts. That's the point, Chris. With me is Chris, who's also here and also not wearing a t-shirt. We are terrible at this.
It's the middle of winter.
Excuse. I'm wearing a short sleeve at least.
That's because you're a crazy person and it's slightly warmer than it should be in your dungeon.
Oh, that is true. My baseboard heat is wildly effective. I mean, it dries out my entire sinus area, but I'm warm.
It keeps you and the mold that it grows very toasty.
Oh, now I have to go look for mold. After the episode, of course, because we have very important things to talk about, don't we?
We do. We are.
Cheese. Cheese?
I'm not opposed. We could just spend 45 minutes listing off various types of cheese.
I don't know if I could do that for 45 straight minutes.
No, I only know like 4 cheeses.
So we just run through those 4 cheeses again and again.
That could work.
We'll start with cheddar.
Could be one of those
American.
anti-humor things.
Yes. Is that one of those things where if we did it long enough, it would become funny again?
I think that's the idea. But more than likely, if we did it long enough, people would just go home.
Where are they now?
I don't know. I'm not the podcast listening audience police.
We don't keep tabs on you. Or do we?
Not all of you.
That's important. Okay, so what are we actually going to talk about today? As if you didn't already know, you looked at the title, wonderful listener.
We're going to talk about the history of cryptography part, and I can't believe I'm saying this, 3.
3 of 1,000?
Yes. 3
Okay.
of is a good way to put it. Because
Okay.
my God.
You chose this for yourself.
It's true. It's true. And if people remember, I actually thought I was going to do all this in one episode, which was hilariously wrong.
You're adorable.
So anyway, a quick recap. In part 1, we went back to the beginning of time, basically.
Mm-hmm.
If not further, which admittedly might have been a mistake. However, did the Big Bang have a secret code in it? You'll have to listen to find out. I can't tell you the episode number because Ned doesn't let me talk about the episode numbers anymore. In any event, the Big Bang may or may not have had secret codes. The ancient Egyptians definitely did. So did the Greeks, as well as the Romans. So did a bunch of people in the Middle Ages. All of them building new and exciting codes on top of the codes that came before them.
Mm-hmm.
Simultaneous to the codes getting more sophisticated, the code breakers got more sophisticated.
Ooh.
In part 2, we continued this historical trend, focusing more this time on the Napoleonic Wars, specifically the adventures or misadventures in Spain, and how an English codebreaker more or less turned the tide of that part of the war, allowing the Duke of Wellington to win a decisive battle at a place called Salamanca.
And thus have a delicious dish named after him. I'm
also
going
a
with that
small
being
lizard.
true.
So a couple of fun facts about that story. First one that I learned When the Duke of Wellington won the Battle of Salamanca, he wasn't the Duke of Wellington yet.
Oh,
In 1812, he was only the Earl of Wellington, which does not have nearly the same ring to it.
it does not. I
He
mean,
was promoted, I guess, to Duke in 1814, which
is
I
that what
guess
is that what they call it when your title gets like enhanced?
elevated. Uh,
We'll workshop it. It's
yeah,
fine.
I don't know. This is just some seriously dumb rich people shit that I don't have time for.
Fair.
Anyway, also, after the war concluded, Wellington went ahead and just forgot all about his code breaking superstar, George Scovell.
Mm.
That George Scovell was, for a time, running the risk of being destitute.
Oh,
He
poor
wrote a
George.
letter to Wellington asking him for help. Wellington never replied. Another member of Wellington's staff eventually came to the rescue, giving Scovell a decently paying, if dead end job, as the head of a military school. Wellington, for his part, for the rest of his political career, claimed that it was in fact the whole staff working together that cracked the codes, never
Hmm.
mentioning Scovell by name. Class act all the way.
Wow.
Yeah. I read a whole ass book about this. I was only going to use it for like one chapter and I got angry and read the whole thing. And yeah, I'm still mad about that.
I love that you like anger read a whole book.
We finished part 2 talking about the Civil War. That's the one in America. And how basically the same kinds of codes had been used there, only with a clever tool that was pocketable and
Hmm.
allowed the decodes and encodes to happen faster. And that was it for part 2.
Yeah,
Now,
and if people watched the YouTube video, I took the time to put visuals in it. And I feel like you're probably going to make me do that again.
we have a YouTube?
Yes. For those who don't know, these episodes are also published on YouTube and you can see our very beautiful faces talk about things. But in the particular case of that episode, you also got to see graphics of what that pocketable device looked like. So that was good. I did a
Yeah.
good thing.
Based on this new information, yeah, I'm going to make you do that again.
Excellent.
One more aside. It was pointed out to me that in episodes 1 and 2, um, what I've been talking about has not actually been encryption per se. Now,
Hmm.
it is kind of picking apart vocabulary, but I think it bears digging into. What we've been talking about is codes and enciphering.
Okay.
A cipher transforms readable text into unreadable text using some kind of an algorithm. And this is
Okay.
usually done on a letter by letter or word by word basis with some other complications thrown in.
Hmm.
So, for example, if you sent a text message to a friend that said, I'll meet you at 1234 right before noon on 5678, this is a very simple cipher. You have created a dictionary of place names and calendar dates the two of you know. Those can be substituted in so that anybody eavesdropping would be clueless as to where or when you were talking about.
Sure.
This is a definition of encipherment.
Hmm.
The more complicated versions of this substitute every single letter, like the Caesar cipher that we talked about in part 1, or the
Hmm.
more complex Vignere cipher we talked about in part 2. Now, one thing that's important about a cipher, utilizing these codes and code books, is that you don't have to encipher every single word, right? Like the example that I just used.
Right.
And oftentimes, people wouldn't bother doing that. Encoding and decoding, or enciphering and deciphering the full message, would take a lot longer. In a lot of these cases, this was done at the time with pen and paper. So there was no reason to do 100% encipherment in people's minds. You only encipher the text that is quote unquote important or sensitive or what have you.
Hmm.
So here's a real life example taken directly from French communications in the Spain campaign of 1811. This is the Vignere cipher I was talking about in episode 2.
Okay.
Quote, I am making haste to pass on the contents to 25, 13, 8, 9, 38, 19. I could go on. There's a lot of numbers.
Okay.
Then it goes back into clear text. Who has ordered me to open communications with you? Unquote.
Okay. I see
So
what you mean.
there's a lot of the message that you can read,
Mm-hmm.
but there are pieces of it that are enciphered. Idea being that this is the secret part that you don't want people to know. Now, in the case of this particular example, this is an example of why this is not a great idea. Because what
Okay.
you get when you have some things enciphered and some things in plain text is a huge amount of context clues.
Right.
So code breakers can use that context clue to try to infer what the coded part of the message means. And in this case, what all the numbers that were listed out broke down to were individual letters that spelled out the name of the person that was in charge of this particular army. SC Le Maréchal Duc de Ragus. There's my French accent. You're all welcome.
Well done.
This was super dumb because number
Yeah.
one, they used his full title. All of those letters, all of that is something that is going to be repeated in these messages. Every time you refer to him, you can't just call him Maréchal because that would be insulting.
Mm-hmm.
But what it does is gives the codebreakers an opportunity to latch onto something that comes up over and over and over again and seems like it might be a name.
Right.
Um, and also, this is something that is totally pointless to encrypt in the first place. The message is going from one army to another. Who do you think they're talking about?
Right.
A lot of the time, this is the sort of thing that allowed codes to be broken, was the sloppiness of the people writing the code.
Yeah, if you decide that you're going to encipher only part of the message, then it's on you to decide what portions of that message is sensitive and which portions you can leave in clear text, but that leaves a lot of room for error.
Exactly. And I want you to keep those terms in mind. I want you to think about context, repeatability, and the errors that are made by people that are sick and tired of encoding messages,
Okay.
because that's going to be important when we talk about the meat of this episode.
Mhm.
And in order to get to the meat of this episode, I'm going to fast forward in time. I'm basically going to skip World War I. Now, I don't necessarily want to, but it doesn't make sense because honestly, it's a lot more of the same.
Mhm.
Codes were still done by hand, if they were done at all. There's a lot of fun stories about Russia. Russia's many major losses came from their penchant for giving up on coding messages and just sending orders to their army in the clear.
Ooh, bad idea.
Also, fun story, the French at a certain point tried to help Russia by giving them basically the Vignere codebooks to use.
Mhm.
This would have greatly enhanced the encryption capabilities of the Russian army. Unfortunately, the people in charge of the Russian army, corrupt and self interested as they were, promptly went ahead and just sold those codebooks over to the Germans. You can't make this stuff up, kids.
Amazing.
So, yeah, on to World War II.
All right.
And the thing everybody wanted to hear about in the first place and has
Uh-huh.
been waiting very patiently,
So patiently.
the Enigma Machine.
Oh, I thought we were going to talk about cheese.
Cheddar.
Yes.
So, okay, let's start simple. Ned, you're simple. What do you know about the Enigma Machine?
It was magic. What I know about the Enigma machine is that it had places place for 3 cylinders that would go in it,
Mhm.
and it had 5 cylinders to choose from. And it basically was like a typewriter, except when you pressed the key, the 3 cylinders would turn the letter that you pressed into some other letter based off of a pattern, and then when you press the next key, the drums would do the same thing, and the same letter would never come out as itself on the other side, and it would sort of rotate through the combinations each time. So an L might translate to A, and then it might translate to T next. So it wasn't consistent in that regard. Am I close?
You're hitting a lot of good points.
Yes, I
Let,
win. Give me the prize.
let's go back in
Cheddar.
time, though. Before World War II started,
Oh,
did you know that the Enigma machine was not actually a state secret?
no.
It
I assumed
started
it
its
was.
life as a commercially available product.
Oh, okay.
It was on the market for like a decade or more before the rise of the Third Reich.
Hmm.
And that is an important thing because that is one main reason that a lot of people worldwide had one to play with when the war started looming.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
The Enigma machine was designed by a German after World War I who recognized that pen and paper ciphers were just not cutting it in the modern world.
Hmm.
You remember above how all those complications and how long it took to code and then decode a message?
Yeah.
Speed is a factor. That was the problem that the Enigma was built to solve. And you are correct in its basic structure. It was basically a typewriter that you used to write the message. However, there's a lot of complexity with electronics. It had 3 rotors, not drums. They're called rotors,
Close.
each one of which had 26 settings. So 26 numbers, one for each letter of the alphabet. Now, each one of these rotors was wired from one side to the other in a random pattern. So remember, we're doing this all numerically for now. Slot 1 could be connected to slot 5, slot 2 could be connected to slot 24, etc. Each rotor was named. So you would have a rotor number 1, rotor number 2, rotor number 3. So every single rotor number 1 that was created was wired randomly, but wired in exactly the same way.
Hmm.
So every kit went out with 3 rotors in the beginning. They were randomly wired, but they were consistent from machine to machine.
Okay.
When you use the Enigma machine, you would put the 3 rotors in whatever order you wanted.
Hmm.
Then you would push them up into whatever number you wanted to start with, and then you would just
Okay.
start typing. And the other thing that you said, the rotors are called that for a reason. They rotate.
Oh, okay.
An electrical circuit, when you hit a key, will go from the key into this mechanism with all the rotors in it. So it'll get scrambled one time through the first rotor, another time through the second rotor, another time through the third rotor. Then it hits a reflector and goes backwards again. So it's been scrambled 6 times,
Okay.
and then it lights up whichever key the ciphertext is going to be.
Okay.
Now, once you let go of that key, you've typed a single key and you let go, the first rotor rotates 1 step. So every time you type a letter, the first rotor, or the fast rotor, rotates every single typed key. Every single 26th key, the rotor next to it clicks 1 time.
Okay.
And every time the middle one goes 26 keys, the rotor next to that rotates.
Okay.
So this is really useful for especially long messages
Hmm.
because the key and the alphabet effectively keeps changing, even if it's 10 or 12,000 letters long. And the most important part about all of this is it's done electronically. It's not done by hand with pen and paper. So the complexity that we're talking about here is physically possible. You can do it without an Enigma machine. It would take you a year to write a shopping list.
Right.
So this was the great innovation of the machine. All you had to do was make sure that you, as the sender, and the person you sent the message to as the receiver, knew the order of the rotors and where to start. So then what would happen is, say I'm sending the message to you. I set up the rotors and I set them all the numbers. Let's just pick some things. Today, the rotor order for January 1st is 312, and the rotors will be started at positions 22, 5, and 16. You and I know that.
Hmm.
Nobody else knows that.
Hmm.
Even though the machine is commercially available, they would have to do trial and error on that message to find those rotor settings in order to decode the message. Imagine how long that would take.
Like a pretty long amount of time, because it would be 3 factorial times like 26 factorial, or 26 times 24 times 25, or so. It's a big number.
Yes.
Number of combinations.
And that set of combinations is exactly why the Germans were so confident that their messages were not breakable. Now,
Mhm.
to be fair, when Germany actually did get on the war footing, they did make the machines even more complicated than that. They went
Sure.
from 3 rotors to 5, like you said.
Mhm.
They also added a plug board in the beginning of the machine that was not commercially available, that
Oh.
further scrambled the messages. So that added even more complexity. And we don't have time to go into exactly all of this stuff, how it works, and what the different permutations look like, because there were more than one Enigma machine over time as they got more complicated. But I think you get the idea.
Mhm.
If people do want to see what it looks like, though, the Enigma Machine Museum is online, and they have a lot of very cool graphics. So, just for fun, let's take a look at what a message that was enigmaed based on the settings I used above would look like. And I've got this fun table that I've been building as we've gone forward. And remember, the rotor settings is what's key. So on day 1, we have the rotor settings that we talked about above. Day
Mhm.
2, we have an agreement that they're going to completely change. So again, even if you break the message from day 1, day 2 you have to start all over again.
Right.
So if you look at these messages, an Enigma message encoded on day 1, an Enigma message coded on day 2, they look completely different. There
Right.
is absolutely no commonality to the
Yeah.
human eye. Or I should say, the non-mathematically inclined eye.
Yeah.
Um, Now, a real Enigma message was also obfuscated in another way. What they did was they made every word 5 letters long and completely discarded all punctuation and all formatting. The
Okay.
idea here was to hide any potential differences between big and small words like or, if, the, etc., in order to further hinder codebreakers. Also, you don't want gigantic names, right?
Mhm.
I simplified the example that I'm showing you, or I should say Ned is showing you on the screen for readability,
You're welcome.
but I think you get the idea. And we will have a link to an actual Enigma message in the show notes if you want to see what a telegram of an Enigma message would look like.
Okay. It
So,
sounds very, very hard to crack, because all the things that you would use as clues before are just not present in this message format.
correct. The Germans did know that brute forcing it was possible, which is one of the reasons they added the additional complications.
Mhm.
But they did not believe that it was practical. And in fact,
Right.
they had such and especially the German army had such an inordinate amount of confidence in this that they sent everything by Enigma. Now, when
Mm.
you talk about code breakers, the more material you give them, the better, right?
Yeah.
And also, like I said, the machine was public. People knew the Germans were using an Enigma.
Mhm.
So they did have a head start there. One of the biggest problems with the machine is exactly what you said, and I'm shocked that you knew this. If you typed a letter on the Enigma with all the complications, no matter what, it wouldn't come up as itself.
Mhm.
A W could be represented by any letter of the alphabet except for W. And that right there is a flaw.
Yes.
What the code breakers were able to do was to start compiling a bunch of these types of flaws. This is not the only one. This is the easiest one to explain. Um, you were able to do this and disqualify things from needing to be brute forced. This was actually Alan Turing's great innovation, was recognizing once you recognize that a code brute force attempt failed, you figure out why, you can disqualify a huge swath of other ways of trying to disqualify it. So you wouldn't have to go rotor setting number 1, rotor setting number 2, rotor setting number 3, because
Hmm.
the disqualifications would disqualify 10 to 20 at a time.
Right.
So you could design a machine like this, which was one of the Bombe machine is what it was called. And also the Colossus machine, which was a different code breaker, but the same idea, and honestly deserves its own episode that Ned will write.
Sure.
That's exactly what these machines did. They took a message, they ran it through the machine that knew, run it through, figure out what was wrong with it, disqualify all these other different potential rotor combinations, and go through that list until you find the one that works. Once you find the one that works, you know that every single message sent that day uses the same rotor combinations. So let's just say the first message of the day takes 3 hours to break.
Hmm.
How long do you think the second message of the day is going to take to break?
As long as it takes to transcribe it, honestly.
Exactly. And with the amount of messages that were being sent back and forth, this is how the Allies built such an intelligence advantage. And it should be noted that the Germans had their own, code breaking expertise and stuff going on as well. They were breaking codes too, but they were breaking them slower, the old fashioned way.
Hmm.
So this was a major, major advantage for the Allies. In addition to the technical flaws that were identified in the Enigma, the codebreakers also relied on the laziness and overconfidence of the Germans.
Hmm. I was going to bring this up, but I wanted to see what you had to say about it.
So, short story long, using the Enigma properly was a pain in the ass.
Fair.
I don't know if that's come across with my descriptions of this machine.
There's a lot to it. Yeah.
Oftentimes, code writers would take shortcuts. Now tell me you haven't heard this story before. Security teams breathing down your back, but you just want to get this message out so you can go home and play Xbox.
Hmm.
Additionally, messages would often start out written super formally and in the exact same way. The kind of to from setup that you would expect on a Christmas present,
Hmm.
along with some kind of honorific sign off. Think back to the beginning of this episode, not unlike the mistakes the French made when they filled out the full title for all their royal governors.
Right. So you could assume, like, at the end of a lot of messages would be something like Heil Hitler or something along those lines. That was the way that you would end every message.
Exactly right. Also, fun fact, the machines that were used to break these codes were called bombs, Bombe.
Hmm.
And nobody knows what that means, but it doesn't mean anything. It's actually because the Polish team that started all of this in the early 30s, they named it after an ice cream treat that they had a lot.
That's amazing.
When Bletchley Park picked up the message, picked up the program and started running with it, they kept the name.
It's a good name.
That's not a bad name at all. So all of this stuff goes into that trial and error, eliminating false positives, making sure that you can get down to the message as fast as possible. When all was said and done, even with all the other complications, 5 rotors, plug board, all of that stuff, by the end of the war, the first message of the day would be decoded in as little as 20 minutes.
Holy shnikes.
Yeah.
That's fast.
And just like in the Napoleonic Wars, the codebreakers had an incredible effect on the war effort. A lot of estimates have their contributions shortening the war by something like 2 to 4 years.
Hmm.
In order to keep the state's secrets, everyone at Bletchley Park basically took a 30-year vow of silence, meaning that most of them never got the credit they deserved.
Hmm.
That goes doubly true for the Polish teams that started this initiative years before the war even began. I mean, raise your hand if you even knew that this initiative was started by a team of Polish cryptographers.
Nope, can't say that I did.
So, if anyone is interested in this and wants to know more, I highly recommend yet another book. This podcast is making me very popular at the library. A book called Codebreakers Victory: How the Allied Cryptographers Won World War II. This is a very detailed history. It goes into how these machines work, but you do not need a math degree to understand it.
You want a slightly less serious, but also very interesting book that's slight historical fiction. The Rose Code by Kate Quinn is also an excellent read. And that's where I found out about some of the things that I know, like that it wouldn't translate to its own letter when you're using the machine, or the fact that the Germans, because they were using the encoding for everything, they would do things like send the weather report every day,
Oh,
and the
yes.
weather report was basically the same most days. Made it very easy to start breaking that code. They didn't use the same exact encoding that more important, higher priority messages did, but it still contributed to the problem. There's another book that I'm totally blanking on the name of, but I will include in the list. It was written about AI broadly, but it gets into a lot of this and talks about some of the decisions that the British and the Americans had to make about playing dumb, about how much of the code they had actually broken. Because if Germany figured out that the codes were no longer useful, they would change their plans. And it was all leading up to D-Day, and so they had to pretend sometimes and even sacrifice ships, even though they had the information that would have prevented their destruction, to keep the fact that the codes were broken a secret.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
an amazing story. It really
Another, I
is.
mean, another good example of that, and I'll just go really quickly through it. One of the most famous broken codes of the war was actually way earlier. It was the Zimmerman telegram.
Hmm.
You remember this one?
It's familiar, but go ahead.
Zimmerman was I think he was a consul. I can't remember now, from Germany to Mexico, and uh, his basic gambit to the Mexican government was, "We will help you with an incursion into the United States in
Hmm.
order to keep the U.S. out of the European war." That was encoded via Enigma and broken almost immediately. And the British were like, "Oh crap! How? What?" So, long story short, again, they basically created a fake intel incident in Mexico so that they could claim that it was personnel on the ground in the embassy that leaked the message, and not the fact that they got it from the Enigma machine and the codes being broken.
But they could still act on the information.
Exactly. And that
Wow.
was one of the main things that pulled America into the European theater.
Amazing.
I know. So, my first episode of the new year, and I went long immediately. And
Shocking.
the amount of stuff that I had to cut out of this was staggering. This could be a whole season.
It really could.
Um, but anyway, I will stop here for now, I promise. And at this point, we're going to bid adieu to ciphers as we have talked about them and start looking at encryption as we understand it today. Because in 1945, Claude Shannon of Bell Labs wrote a paper, actually, it was a series of papers, called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. This paper was so forward looking that it wasn't even allowed to be published until 1949.
Wow.
And in the words of Bell Labs themselves, it, quote, essentially spawned the digital age, unquote. This spawning, okay, I regret that wording already, but I'm going with it. This spawning, one of the big pieces of it was modern cryptography.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to that when you get around to it. Hey, thanks for listening or something. I guess you found it worthwhile enough if you made it all the way to the end. So, congratulations to you, friend. You accomplished something today. Now you can go sit on a couch, fire up an Enigma machine, and type in the weather to a friend. You've earned it. You can find more about the show by visiting our LinkedIn page. Just search Chaos Lever or go to our website, chaoslever.com, where you'll find show notes, blog posts, and general tomfoolery. We'll be back next week to see what fresh hell is upon us. Ta ta for now. Yeah,
I
with the
mean,
extreme British slant of this particular episode, ta ta for now feels very on the nose.
feels very on the tea and crumpets. I got nothing, man. I'm so tired.